very important to very briefly address. One was the protomental system, and the other, the Bion mentioning something about what later will become countertransference. In his experiences in groups, which, as you know, came from his pre-psychoanalytic time when he was the family psychiatrist, and what had been in his first analysis with John Brickman for a short time, but not for training purposes back then. And then John Brickman and him became partners in times of war to study and work with the groups of soldiers that came back injured or traumatized from the front. Does anybody remember or have an idea what the protomental system is? What Dandoli said, Bion said about that? It had to do with the basic assumptions, right? You mentioned four kinds.
Was it the protomental?
The protomental system, yes. Do you remember, Julie?
Vaguely that it was something about, well, I guess it's related to his concept of preconception as some sort of common combined form from which the basic assumptions. So it's a place where the basic assumptions reside and stem for when they're not active, something like that.
Exactly, yes, that's right. It's not a preconception. Preconception is a different concept that will come up later in his theory of thinking. But the protomental system, Bion asked himself, and we have to understand that he doesn't mean that the protomental system is something that you can photograph or that you can touch. It's part of a theory that he was building in order to be able to operate and to think about group phenomena, right? The question he tried to respond is, being that observing groups can here work as a work group, as a thinking group that is trying to think how to best perform a task, and that is also able to have as a task the reflection on the nature of the group itself, right? Let's say if we decide, for instance, to say, well, let us stop for a while and to see and to discuss how are we functioning as a group? What kind of a group are we? How are we functioning when we go into our discussions, etc., etc.? Well, then the task of the group is to reflect on the group, to reflect on our dynamics. That's the task. For as long as we perform that task, right, we discuss and we try to observe and try to understand, we are functioning at the level of a work group. But what Bion says is that here and there, basic assumptions will emerge. And when they don't, but they might at any other moment, the question is, where did the basic assumptions go? Be it that Bion contends that our minds are set up as a group, right? And only when we come together in effect as a group does the groupish part of our mind emerge. That is also, just to remind you something we said last time, what the transference is about, right? That is, a patient suffers, let's say, from a neurosis, which means something between himself and his internal objects, right? That kind of neurotic relation to the patient's internal objects will become manifest in the relation to the analyst. But it's not that the relation to the analyst provokes something that wasn't there, only that it allows that something that was internal will emerge in the relation. Of course, the same can be said of any relation with anybody else. If you suffer from a neurosis, your neurosis will emerge with your spouse, with your children, with a job, with your boss, and so on. Only that in all those places, it's not the purpose to observe or discuss your neuroses, right? If you have a neurotic problem with your spouse, you will have a marital problem. Your spouse is not supposed to be your analyst and to try to see what internal conflicts you have that is provoking that. No, when your boss or your teacher, if you're neurotic with your boss, it's likely that you're risking your job, right? If that happens with your analyst, well, the analytic setting is such that it's there so that these phenomena can be observed, thought about, and discussed. Same thing happened with groups, right? The internal groupishness emerges. Now, the proto-mental system then...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So the internal groupishness then would not be equated with a set of internal objects that one carried around. That's not the same thing.
Well, that's a very good question. For what reasons it came to your mind?
Why did it come to my mind?
No, I say for good reasons it came to your mind.
Can you repeat the question, please, Robert?
You repeat your question.
I'm wondering whether what was your phrase? Groupishness.
Groupishness, yes.
Groupishness is can or can't be equated with the internal objects that one has inside oneself. Well, in internal objects. I mean, my next thought was, by calling it a groupishness, does that pertain then more to the real people in that group and less internal, to a lesser extent, internal objects, or not? Maybe not.
Did you understand the question, Julie?
Yeah, if they were the actual people, and so it's interrelated rather than the internal objects within the people of the group. I think that's what you were asking.
Well, I think Tamara was also asking whether the groupishness, that is the groupish mind in each individual, could also be equated
With the internal.
Right, the relation of the ego to its objects.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it certainly is connected. That's why you connected it. Right? It is connected.
It must be connected.
Pardon me?
I'm guessing it must be connected.
It is connected, evidently. Right? In the same way as the transference. I mean, why do we make transference? Why does the transference happen all the time and can be observed right away the moment a client comes into the office of the analyst? It's not the analyst that is bringing in the transference, it's the client that's bringing in the transference, because the mind is already predisposed in such a way that the transference will happen no sooner two people get together. Right?
I guess that the difference, would the difference in groups be that there would be some kind of development of a combined expression of the internal object? I guess a basic assumption is that the group sort of joins together in that combined unconscious process.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, that is, but that's also not that different, isn't it? Because if we think also in terms of transference, certainly the transference with your analyst creates something that in a group you would call the group culture.
Yeah.
In relation to your analyst, I mean, we don't have a name for that, but we could call it, if we want to call it something, we would call it the transference culture, right? That is the kind of relationship that your transference built up in relation with your analyst, who himself has his own unconscious and his own mindset to combine with that of the patient.
Right.
Right? But in any case, my question was much simpler than that, and of course we could go on and on and on forever. The proto-mental system was Bion's response to his question, where do the inactive basic assumptions go until they become active again? Since his idea is that they are there hovering around all the time and that potentially they can become active at any moment, and they do.
I would assume that that question would be answered just by the concept of psychic structure. I mean, there must be some significance he's placing on this for it to become a concept, like, to name it like this, huh?
Well,
I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the way Bion names that is the proto-mental system. He says it goes into a place called the proto-mental system. Right? The proto-mental system is observable in groups, meaning that we are a group, we are working, right? Perhaps I'm taking the leadership, right? Explaining these concepts. So we are a work group, but also basic assumption of dependence, right? I mean, you assume that I know and that I can explain it better than anybody else in this moment. So you're looking at me, and this makes of us a dependent group. It's a specialized dependent group, right? And just like the church is a specialized dependence group, you look at God, right? The learning instance, when you take a teacher that you assume knows or knows better, that is a specialized dependence group, right? But it's also a work group because we're working on something. But the fact that it is one thing doesn't take away that underneath that there is also basic assumption of dependence, the assumption that I know.
But that there's a corollary, what that word, corollary,
Corollary.
that one,
Yes.
to that, insofar as to depend on a teacher to be, in order to be a teacher, one needs someone to teach.
Yes.
So the role is more exchangeable, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
The dependence is mutual but different.
Right.
So could that dependence group also be defined by the reverse, by the existence of students and teacher, but flipping it?
Well,
or does that not equate it to dependence?
Well, not really. I think what you're talking about is structure. In this case, the psychic structure, as you say, or group structure. That certainly, for any group to be anything, there has to be a group, right? For a basic assumption of dependence, there has to be someone who is eligible or who has been elected to become the leader of the dependent group, but not because he has decided it, or not that alone, but also because the group has basically agreed in unspoken ways. That's the basic assumption. It's not willfully thought of or decided, right? But the group has tacitly agreed that this is what we want. We want to believe that this someone is the one who knows, and we will let him think for us, right? Which I think gets back to your question from last time, because you said, well, but we are also active participants in that we listen, try to think, and try to understand. Well, that belongs to the work group. The basic assumption is basically not thinking. You let one do the whole work, right? And you just sit there and relax and say, well, he knows, so let him talk, he knows, right? We just follow. We don't need to work on that and try to understand it. We just follow.